Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. In case you're new, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without any help from grow lights or greenhouses or heat mats, humidifiers, etc. I just grow them indoors or outdoors or not at all. I post every week, so if that's of any interest, do hit subscribe to follow my very amateurish adventures. And this week, plant lovers, it just so happens that I have a Miltonia and a Miltoniopsis in bloom, and I thought, what better opportunity than to try and explain the difference between the two and the two different care requirements needed for these reasonably similar and closely named cousins. All right, let me give you a little rundown. This is Miltonia Guanabara. I've made a video about this, which I'll link below. And this baby here is Miltoniopsis Kelly Spangled Banner, which I've also made videos about, which I will also link below. But it's really good timing, they're both in bloom. So generally this Miltoniopsis blooms twice in a year for me, generally in autumn. It's a little bit early, but that's okay because it coincides nicely with this. And I can describe the differences between the two types, but also the care conditions, because I've only just got this one right. All right, shall we start with Miltonia? I won't go into too much detail because I have made a video about it, but let's just say Miltonia are Brazilian. They are lower elevations, the northeast of the country, and like warmer temperatures and more humidity than their cousins. So one of the things about growing them is essentially they won't grow in the same place. I have found that my Miltonia didn't bloom when I basically gave it quite lazily the same care as Miltoniopsis. Silly me, who'd have thought they'd need different care? In a nutshell, Miltonia is going to need more warmth and more humidity and brighter light, I feel, than its Miltoniopsis cousins. So for me, that means I grow this indoors all year. It has quite bright indirect light most of the year. And most mornings I mist it with a mister because it likes to be humid, and particularly around, as you can see, these aerial roots around here. So as a type, I find that it does like more water than its Miltoniopsis cousins. And not to say though that it wants to be kept moist, it just consumes a lot of water, I find, when it's growing. So just keep an eye on that. It's an epiphyte, as is its cousin, and that means a loose free draining medium. And I have got, which is pretty typical for me, medium-sized bark with a little bit of sphagnum moss, with a bit of charcoal, a bit of perlite, some shell grit and mycorrhizal fungi in there as well. And when I pot the orchids, I always put a few grains of a slow release fertilizer in it. So that is Miltonia in a nutshell. Warm ambient temperatures, good humidity, plenty of water but not too wet, free draining medium, and it does have, as you can see, this quite vigorous, let's just say, running rhizome growth, which means it can be quite difficult to contain. They are vigorous, they make great specimens quite quickly. I've had this one for 2 years. Mine's in terracotta, but you can pot it in whatever's going to work in your environment. I like terracotta because it evaporates quickly, doesn't stay damp too long, which can damage roots, and it also evaporates, so it creates a bit of humidity around the plant. And just to amp up the humidity for this one, I also keep the dish that it sits in full of some pumice pebbles, which then just help to create that humidity around the base of the plant. For me, the growth season is in spring, and each new growth as it matures sends out a flower spike, and for me that has only happened once a year. Perhaps where you are though, they might do it differently, but for me, just once a year. Okay, let us now move on to its kissing cousin, Miltoniopsis. Both names were given in honour of a gent in England called Viscount Milton, who was a great botanist and amateur collector of plants. Hence the Milton bit of the name belongs to him. Kelly Spangled Banner has the most beautiful fragrance, as actually does Guanabara. Now Guanabara smells, it's really hard to describe, but it's like a beautiful, spicy restaurant. Not too spicy, it's not specific. Whereas Kelly Spangled Banner, sweeter but still spicy. Very, very beautiful. So both orchids are fragrant, and they do tend to switch on their fragrance mid-ish morning till late-ish afternoon when they're sort of busy attracting their pollinators. So it's great to have them in an area perhaps where you can smell them. All right, so Miltoniopsis comes from a different part of South America. It's endemic to the northwest and higher altitudes in the Andes. So it's in damper forests than its Miltonia cousin, which means two things. Firstly, not an orchid to allow to dry out. Again, it doesn't mean you've got to keep it wringing wet, but just make sure that it doesn't dry out too much between waterings. Second thing is temperatures. So Miltoniopsis likes a bit of a cooler bandwidth. You can go relatively low, and I have made a few mistakes with the minimum. So I would say not below 10 degrees Celsius, which is about 55 Fahrenheit. It could, if you didn't go any colder than that, live outdoors all year, under cover, under shade and protection, obviously. But for me in Melbourne, our winters can just drop below that minimum. Not often, but enough to damage plants, which has happened to me, and I've made videos about that, so I'll link that below. Do not freeze your Miltoniopsis. But it doesn't cope with warm weather. So Miltonia does. It loves sunning on the beach. It does love warmer, brighter conditions, and Miltoniopsis still needs bright light, but it does need cooler temperatures. So in my house, I grow this indoors in winter, outdoors in summer. And if you watched an epic grow space video I made, my Miltoniopsis sit at the base of the stairs, which is quite cool, on the darker side of bright light, but in winter it does get quite beautiful ambient light. But the nighttime minimum is low, but not below 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees centigrade. Kind of perfect. But you know what? Why don't I show you, in fact, where Miltoniopsis and Miltonia are living? Because I do think that helps in some degree. Here we are at our sun-filled landing, and here is the resting place of Miltonia. So this window is north facing, and we get an amazing wash of light. It is more of a general wash in summer because the sun is higher, but in winter the sun is lower, so we actually sort of get more stronger light penetration. But it is always a higher ambient temperature up here than downstairs, strangely enough, and brighter. So this is the best spot for our Miltonia friend, and of course I missed it every morning. So our Miltoniopsis friend lives both indoors and outdoors. It is bi-coastal, and in winter it lives at the bottom of the stairs in this spot here. Now this gets the same northern light from that window, but being at the base of the stairs, and it is quite close to the front door, it is always quite a few degrees cooler. But it doesn't get super cold, obviously, because we're living here. So the winter nighttime minimums are great, and obviously the maximums are fine. It still gets quite strong, beautiful, filtered light in winter, not as strong as upstairs for the Miltonia, but nonetheless, it is still quite a bright spot. And then in summer, our Miltoniopsis takes a trip outside, and to be honest, lives in a spot that I can really find for it, which at the moment is along here. So we get quite beautiful morning easterly light that comes through here, but it is still very shady down here. It doesn't get too hot, maximum during the day, which in summer is the thing that you have to be careful with Miltoniopsis, because they do not like the heights of temperatures that Miltonia can take. So this is a cooler spot. It is a little on the shadier side, but it's still quite bright indirect light for most of the day. And food-wise, our Miltonias and Miltoniopsis friends get basically the same. The only difference being that in spring and autumn, I give Miltoniopsis a topical slow-release fertilizer, whereas Miltonia only gets fed once a year. But they do both get liquid fertilizer during the growing season, which is spring, summer, early autumn, and that can be a liquid fertilizer that is orchid specific, or it could be seaweed based or fish emulsion based, whatever it might be. I just always dial it down to about 1/8 of the recommended dose on the bottle. And the stupid thing was that I had this one in exactly the same spot for the first year I had it, and guess what? Nothing happened. It did produce vegetative growth, but none of those produced flower spikes. Since I moved it upstairs into a warmer atmosphere, and I really focused on misting it every morning to keep up the humidity, it's bloomed for me. And potting wise, Miltoniopsis, as you can see from this, can create quite vigorous specimens quite quickly. And I have got this in terracotta for the same reasons as the other one. The growth habit, though, as you can see, is very different with Miltoniopsis. So it tends to grow like an oncidium perhaps, but I would also say that the grow points are 360. So it grows out exponentially rather than in a direction, which is great because you get to fill the pot up relatively quickly and you get a symmetrical plant, whereas our lovely Miltonia, as you can see, wants to run for the hills and is growing in that linear pattern. So slightly tricky to manage, very easy to manage in pot culture. Medium wise though, it's basically the same as its Miltonia cousin. There is perhaps a little bit more sphagnum in this for me, just to keep the roots moist without getting them wet. But again, depends where you live as to the mix that you make. Aren't those flowers gorgeous? Now, here's the thing. This lives outside and you can see perhaps this flower has been nibbled by something. Little caterpillars, I think, the little beasts. Anyway, price you pay. The other curious thing about this year is it is sending up single budded flower spikes like this one from the crown of the pseudobulb. Now, I have never seen this before. Generally, this flowers in the same way as an oncidium. So you have the pseudobulb, you have the two leaves either side, and the flower spike emerges in the nook of that leaf axis. So between the pseudobulb and the leaf, and the flower spike comes out and Bob's your uncle. Sometimes though it does get stuck, so it is useful just to keep your eye on Miltoniopsis when they are spiking. I've had a few that kind of got stuck and then the spike withers, which is heartbreaking because the pseudobulb will only flower once. It matures, flowers, and then it has to produce new growths to flower for you. So if you get one wrong or something happens, you kind of got to wait for the next cycle, which is unfortunate. And talking of life cycles, Miltoniopsis will bloom twice in the year as long as you're giving it the right conditions. So what it needs is to produce a growth which just about is mature when it will then send out flower spikes. It will then very quickly start to send out new growths exponentially 360 degrees all the way around the plant, and that will happen twice a year. So I tend to get a flush in spring and a flush as we are now. It's actually still summer, so it's a little bit early for me, but generally in autumn, which is great. Now, I'm not sure, perhaps where you are, if you're in somewhere warmer and more tropical, you might find Miltonia bloom twice a year, but I feel that the growth is different and Miltonia bloom as the new growth's emerging, and I feel that only happens once a year. Does for me, maybe for you in a different part of the world, it might be different. But Miltoniopsis definitely produces 2 growth cycles a year and 2 blooming periods a year. And watering, so slightly different to Miltonia. Miltonia does, I think, come from drier but more humid areas. So saying, for me, it is a thirsty beast. Doesn't want to be kept wet, but it just seems to consume more water. So it's something to bear in mind. Miltoniopsis doesn't want to dry out, and so my way of kind of dealing with that is just a little often, just sort of into the crown and around the base as you can, so that the medium never really dries out, but it's certainly not wringing wet. But if you put your finger in, you'd only have to go down half a knuckle to reach moisture. So obviously dial it up in summer, dial it down in winter when it's cooler, because orchids do not like to be both wet and cold equals death. There we go. The difference between growing Miltoniopsis and Miltonias. They do unfortunately require quite different conditions, which means you can't actually grow them in the same space. Well, I couldn't anyway. Miltoniopsis certainly likes cooler summer temperatures. I think Miltonia can go way up as long as it's kept moist and humid. But yeah, slightly different, and it took me a year to figure that one out, so here I am sharing what is perhaps obvious with you all, that this is much cooler, this is a much warmer grower. There are many hybrids of both, so wherever you are you'll be able to find great hybrids, I'm sure. The fragrance is beautiful, and once you've found the right spot, they're very easy. I think they just take care of themselves. As long as you get the temperature and of course everything else right, you'll have beautiful orchids. There you are, plant lovers. I hope you have enjoyed what is the difference between Miltonia and Miltoniopsis 101. Plant lovers, thank you very much for finding me. Thank you for watching. Thank you for commenting. If that's your thing, do remember I am an amateur and I really do not know anything. But I post every week, so hit subscribe if you want to know what my adventures might be. And I certainly look forward to seeing you next week with another orchidy adventure.